what is up, CMS? So glad to be back with you guys once again for our big picture series that we're looking at. My name is Frank. If you don't know me, this is my daughter Rayleigh. We're just hanging out here at home because it is quarantine during this COVID. So yeah, welcome to my living room / dining room. The computer's right here on my table. So yeah, it's a little bit different than normal. But yeah, we're in week 4 of this big picture series where we're looking at the life of Joseph. And as we've learned over the last few weeks, Joseph's life was all kinds of crazy. Like some pretty messed up stuff happened to him, in his life. And he found himself in some really difficult and even scary situations at times. Now, we have the privilege of knowing the bigger picture of Joseph's story and how God was working things out for good in his life. But at the time, Joseph really didn't know what was going to happen next. He had no clue how things were going to end up, and he really only had what he had in front of him happening. So I want all of you to just imagine being in Joseph's shoes at this moment, right? So what we've learned over the last couple of weeks is that he went from being his dad's favorite son to his siblings betraying him, right? They planned to kill him, to then actually changing their minds and selling him into slavery, right? His situation does start to look up when he's put in charge of the household of the master who bought him, this guy named Potiphar. But then things start to fall apart again when Potiphar's wife tries to come on to Joseph. And, he still did the right thing, right? He was like, no, I'm not doing this. She lied, and he ended up being in jail, right? So put yourself in his shoes for a moment, right? If I were in his shoes, I would be asking myself, like, what is the point of all of this, right? Like, honestly, we've probably all had moments like that, right? Where we're just asking ourselves the same thing. We've all had circumstances, maybe not exactly like Joseph's, but we've all been through situations where we're asking ourselves, what the heck is the point of all of this, right? Situations where we might have just been left disappointed, or situations that we might not necessarily want to be in, right? We might be left thinking to ourselves, what is the point of all of this? Why am I going through all of this? Why does it have to be like this? And I know for me, I personally have had situations like this before. So when I was in 5th grade, my parents decided to move, right? And we were living in the same house that I grew up in my entire life. I never moved before that. And I mean, normally moving is a big change, right? Sure. But what was it about the move that had me thinking to myself, what is the point? Well, honestly, I struggled like a lot. And I had a hard time making friends at school. So one, right? Imagine coming from a family who doesn't have a whole lot, right? And then moving to an area where most of the people were wealthy, right? Most of the families that went to the school that I went to were super, super wealthy. And imagine being made fun of because the clothes that you wore were not from American Eagle or from all the places that everyone else shopped at, but they were more from like thrift stores and things of that nature, right? That was my story. And honestly, I had a hard time making friends that first year. But on top of that, to make matters worse, I had a really, really hard time in school, right? Even though I was in the same grade as the kids that I was in class with, the school that I was at before was probably about a year behind the school that I was now at. At the old school, like I was one of the top students, right, in my class. But I really, really struggled to get good grades in my new school because really I was catching up. And I hated the moments when I got called on to read in front of class. I hated being called on to come in the front of the room to do math problems. And I absolutely hated team projects, right? And this kind of even continued up into middle school, right? There were times where I felt like, what is the point? What is the point of trying to make new friends? What is the point of trying to do well in school? And at the time, I couldn't see the bigger picture, right? And maybe you've had a similar experience to me, right? Maybe you've had something that left you feeling the same way that I was feeling. So maybe for you, school bullies have made you feel like that. All right. Or maybe you and your friends are drifting apart and you're just thinking to yourself, man, like what's the point? Like what's the point of me even trying in that? Or maybe you're trying your hardest, right? And you don't make the basketball team, or you don't land the lead in the play, right? Or even a part in the play. Maybe it's something that's really, really painful, right? Like maybe seeing a loved one struggle with illness, or maybe even passing away. Or maybe you're dealing with things like severe anxiety and depression, and you just don't know like how to deal with it. Maybe your parents are going through divorce, or they're having money problems right now with COVID and all the things that we have going on right now. Maybe you've been placed in foster care, or even maybe someone close to you has been really seriously hurt and you have no idea how they're going to come back from it. Maybe you've even felt the same way in your faith, right? You come to church, you read from the Bible, you sometimes pray, but nothing really feels like it's all that different, right? You want to connect with God, but nothing happens. Situations like this can leave us all wondering, what the heck is the point? Right? And the truth is, we're all going to experience situations that make us feel that way, right? It's hard to see the bigger picture when we're in the midst of these types of situations, right? Sometimes all we can think is, what is the point? And that kind of brings us right back to the story of Joseph's life, right? Remember, he was on this roller coaster of wins and losses. And honestly, probably more losses than wins. Remember, his brothers betrayed him. They stole from him. They faked his death, right? They sold him into slavery. And then as things started to look up, then Potiphar's wife decides that she wants to try and come on to him, and then lies about it and says that he was the one who did that. And then he gets thrown into jail. Right? Joseph was just trying to do the next right thing in his life, but he was just taking loss after loss after loss. Right? Like, that is unbelievably unfair. Right? I know if it was me, I would have been thinking things like, you have got to be kidding me. Like, could things literally get any worse from where they currently are? Like, how long do I have to continue taking losses before things change? Like, what is the point of all this? And those are all fair questions, especially given the situation that Potiphar was in. Or Joseph, not Potiphar. But what's crazy is that Joseph was still faithful, right, in the situation, even though he didn't know the big picture, right? Joseph still did the right things, but he seemingly ended up with the short end of the stick every single time, right? He was sitting in jail at this point, not knowing if or when he would ever have freedom again, right? But thankfully, God was working a bigger picture, right? God had a bigger picture in mind for Joseph. And even though Joseph couldn't see while he was sitting in jail that God was working behind the scenes, right? God was still working for good. In the midst of Joseph's pain, God was still working for good, right? So while Joseph was in prison, he wasn't alone, right? There were these two pretty important guys from Pharaoh's house, right? And Pharaoh was the king of the land, right? That Joseph was in. So he was like tip top. So there were two guys from his house that were thrown into jail with him. So one was his baker, two was his cup bearer. Now, I'm sure you can guess what a baker does, right? But a cup bearer, like what is that about? And a cupbearer pretty much is just a trusted person who would serve Pharaoh his drinks and make sure that they weren't poisoned, right? So that's what the cupbearer did. Anyways, let's get back to the story. All right. So Joseph didn't know at the time, but these guys were going to play a huge role in his story. So let's look at what happens next with them. So Genesis 40, verses 5 through 8. While they were in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream one night. Each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed that they both looked upset. "Why do you look so worried today?" he asked them. And they replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean." "Interpreting dreams is God's business," Joseph replied. "Go ahead and tell me your dreams." Now, this might not seem like that remarkable of a story, right? It's just two guys who had weird dreams, right? Well, back in those days, like, people believed that dreams were actually just a prediction of what might happen in the future. So when people had weird dreams, they would go and try and find someone to help them figure out or try and understand what the dream meant, right? So enter Joseph, right? Who knew that God would help him interpret these dreams. So what did he do? That's exactly what he did. He interpreted their dreams for them. So Joseph listened to them, and God showed him what the dreams meant. So this is going to kind of get a little bit intense here for a second, right? So the cupbearer's dream meant that Pharaoh would restore him to his position in 3 days, right? That's absolutely fantastic news for the cupbearer. The baker, on the other hand, he kind of got the short end of the stick, right? His dream meant that Pharaoh was going to execute him. Yikes. Like, that really stinks. But either way, right, Joseph helped these guys understand their dreams, right? But he just had one request of the cupbearer, right? When the cupbearer was restored to his position with the Pharaoh, that he would mention Joseph and get him out of prison, right? Should be easy enough, right? The cupbearer, let's see what happens though. Let's see what happens next. So we're looking at Genesis 40, verses 20 through 23. Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later, and he prepared a banquet for all of his officials and staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join the other officials. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position, so he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. But Pharaoh impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had predicted when he interpreted the dream. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph and never gave him another thought. So 2 important things happened here, right? So first, everything God told Joseph would happen did happen. Like, sorry, baker, like, it happened, right? But second, even after all of that, right, Joseph was completely forgotten. Like, come on, cupbearer, like, you literally had one job. One job. All right, could you imagine how hopeless Joseph must have been after that, right? He probably thought this was his absolute last chance at having freedom again. But once again, we can only assume that he was asking himself, like, what is the point of all this suffering, right? Nothing is ever going to change. That's what I would have thought, at least, right? And for a while there, that probably seemed like it was true. Because the Bible tells us that it took 2 full years for anything to change for Joseph, right? Joseph didn't have the bigger picture in the story, the whole story, like we do. He didn't know what was happening for 2 years. He didn't know what God was working, right? Imagine your life completely falling apart and you just falling deeper and deeper and deeper into this pit. And for 2 whole years, not hearing a single thing, right? Imagine your life falling apart, right? If I was Joseph, again, like, I would be thinking, what is the point? If he wasn't already thinking that, he was probably thinking that now. But what happens next kind of brings an entirely new meaning to better late than never. So Pharaoh had this dream that no one could interpret for him. Right? And you can kind of guess what happens next, right? The cupbearer finally remembers that guy who he was in prison with, who interpreted his dream. Dude, like, how could you forget that? Like, Seriously. But just like that, things finally turn around for Joseph. He got his chance, right? Pharaoh called on Joseph to interpret his dream, and God helped him do that once again. But let's look at what happened next, right? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours." Dude, finally, after all the struggle, after all of the suffering, the slavery, the imprisonment, the abandonment, Joseph finally got good news, right? Good news that would change his life forever. And man, like, seriously, like, after all that time, like, it's literally about time. But here's the thing, guys. Here's the thing. This isn't about Joseph finally getting good news or a happy ending or that glow up that he got because he's like second in command, right? It's about the bigger picture. God was writing a much bigger story. And in the midst of his painful and difficult circumstances, Joseph was being positioned to do something great. He was being positioned to do something only he could do. Joseph's life was full of pain and problems, but through it all, God was creating a better future for Joseph. Joseph just had to be willing to trust God and trust God that he could use Joseph wherever he was for good. And the epic part about this story is that it's the same thing for you and I, right? We may not understand why we're dealing with pain or problems or why we're dealing with circumstances that are less than what we'd want them to be. But we can trust that there is a bigger picture for our lives, just like there was a bigger picture for Joseph's life, right? And while creating our bigger picture, God is working for our good. Like, we could totally trust that. It may not always look the way that we want it to, and honestly, like, it didn't for Joseph, right? I'm sure he would have loved to just skip to the part where he was second in command to Pharaoh. But we can trust that God is helping us right where we are. We can trust that he is working towards what is best for us, even if we can't see it or understand it. In other words, when you can't see the bigger picture, just trust that God is working for your good. But how do we do that, right? That is the $1 million question, right? Instead of trying to find the point in our pain and our suffering, how do we trust that God is working for our good? Well, I think there's a couple of things that we could do to be able to do that, right? So number one, exercise faith, right? Choose to believe and trust that God is good and that God is fully in control. In those moments where you're just asking yourself, what is the point? Like, what is the point? Remind yourself of the truth that he is good no matter what our circumstances are and that he is in control. Number two, look for the good. It's easy to want to rush past our problems in the moment, right? But when we pause and take a step back, we can sometimes see the good in situations. We can learn things about ourselves and about others. We could grow in the process. And while we may not always see God working things out for our good, we can always choose to look for it because it's there, right? He is doing good. Number three is seek encouragement. There's going to be times where we might lose sight of that truth, right? That God is working out for our good. In those times, lean into someone who could point you back to the truth, right? Ask them to tell you a story about when God was working things out for their good, but they couldn't necessarily see it, right? They couldn't necessarily see the bigger picture. Use their experience to encourage you through those difficult times. So remember, when you can't see the bigger picture, trust that God is working out for your good. So as you guys start your small group discussion, I just want you to think about one thing. What's a situation in my life that I don't understand the point of? Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you.